Did you know that after the September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City, 1.8 million tons of wreckage was recovered from the site and that the cleanup took 9 months? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about the aftermath of 9/11 with poet Andrea Carter Brown on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore Andrea Carter Brown's eyewitness account of the 9/11 attack and its aftermath. But first, a trivia question. On September 11, 2001, nearly 3,000 people were killed in the terrorist attacks in the USA. How many of those killed were firefighters and paramedics? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have Andrea Carter Brown on the show today. Andrea is the author of The Disheveled Bed and 2 chapbooks, Domestic Karma and Brook and Rainbow. Poems from her latest book, September 12th, won the James Dickey Prize from 5 Points, the River Styx International Poetry Prize, and the National Poet Hunt from the MacGuffin. They are cited in the Library of Congress online guide to the poetry of 9/11 and have been featured on NPR. An avid birder, she lives in Los Angeles where she grows limes, lemons, oranges, and tangerines in her backyard. When I learned about Andrea's unique 9/11 experience, my curiosity was immediately piqued and I wanted to learn more. I hope this interview with Andrea will spark your curiosity too. Welcome to the show, Andrea. It's great to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here, Karen, or Dr. B. Anyway, thanks for having me.
What's the most important thing I should know about you?
The most important thing is that I'm a poet, and I wrote a collection of poetry about my experiences on 9/11 and during the aftermath, which was published for the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and the book is called September 12th.
You were a former resident of downtown Manhattan who lived a block from the World Trade Center on 9/11. Tell us how the attack on the World Trade Center impacted you.
Well, there's hardly a way that it didn't impact me. I fled that morning. I saw terrible things. I survived, so we should get the most important thing down first. My health was compromised. Our apartment was uninhabitable for months. When we did finally move back in 6 months later, we found that the disruption, actually the destruction of our neighborhood meant that life was very difficult in a nitty-gritty way, but also the memories of what that event triggered in us constantly. And we tried to make a go of it. We listened to the public boosters who encouraged us not to be defeated by the event. But the reality was that for us, a place which we had loved and loved living in would no longer be without the freight of that day. And 3 years later, we moved to California, where we've been ever since.
And the move to California was prompted by what?
It was the one place in the United States where both my husband and I could work. So it seemed like the obvious choice. We didn't want to change careers. As a poet, I can write anywhere, and I actually do well writing outside of where I live. I've grown convinced that this book would not have been finished if we had stayed in New York. That moving clear across the country, actually, to a place which was beautiful in a completely different way, in which I felt relatively safe. Not feeling safe was a big part of the problem. after 9/11 in New York City, but feeling distant, both physically and psychologically, from the place where 9/11 happened, gave me the perspective to write the book.
So how do you think that your fellow New Yorkers were impacted by the events of 9/11?
Oh, in all the ways I was and some others. The disruption of life in New York City was complete from 14th Street south to the Battery. For a long time, there were no subways. There was no public transportation. People were not allowed to go near the site, partly for security reasons, partly for health reasons. Everything revolved around attending to getting the fires out that burned there, recovering the remains, and then eventually deciding what to do there. By the following spring, tourists were coming to see the site, so it felt like we were living in a fishbowl of gawkers. I understand the impulse to get close to where it happened, but nonetheless, for those of us who were still trying to live there, it was an additional, I don't want to overstate it, but it felt like a violation to be on display, to be regarded as someone. I could see it register in people's expressions when they looked at me living so close by. Oh, she lives here. Oh, was she there? Oh, what happened to her? But in addition to that, many people left immediately. The apartment complex that we lived in, which was the closest apartment complex in Battery Park City to the site, which, as you said, was a block away. On September 10th, there were 5,500 residents in 3 towers and 3 wings that connected them. By the time we moved back there were only 500 of us. So there are people living all over the country who chose to leave. People with children left almost immediately because the air was toxic when the wind blew. And so children were not allowed to play outdoors. People with pets eventually left when they learned that walking their dogs, the paws became ulcerated from chemicals that were lying on the surface of the soil. Eventually, the environmental agencies came in and mandated that the top layer of soil would be removed. So, in fact, even the areas that weren't destroyed had to be remediated and looked like they had been destroyed. Most of the people who stayed were elderly people on fixed incomes. And those are the neighbors that we would see in the elevators. We were not elderly at the time, but we had, as I said, we had loved living there. And we didn't want to accept that that was lost. And also, there were so many other things that were lost that seemed so much more important. And so we felt guilty feeling that regret. And we had both lived in New York City basically our entire adult lives. I went to college there. My husband went to graduate school there, but he was born in Manhattan. So leaving Manhattan felt like a terrible sacrifice to him. And up until 9/11, he had worked occasionally in Los Angeles, where we live, and the threat of earthquakes was paramount in his mind. If it weren't for earthquakes, we probably would have moved here because his career did better here. But once 9/11 happened, earthquakes seemed relatively benign a risk. You don't have control over them. It isn't prompted by other people attacking you, which is a hard thing to accept.
How do you think the city itself changed as a result of the attacks on 9/11?
That is a fantastic question, and no one has asked me that. Initially, and this has been written about a lot, the city pulled together and people pulled together. For the first time in my memory, people stopped when they heard sirens, and you would see clusters of people on street corners, clusters of cars actually pulling to the side of the road to make room for emergency vehicles. That lasted maybe a month or two. And then gradually, you can't live the pitch of being devastated and frightened and the pitch of loss indefinitely. If eventually you put it not behind you, but you let it go to the back burner and you try to resuscitate or revive everything that you can of the life that you had. But what did happen after that initial period of grace, I would put it, of sense of community, of shared grief. And that went on for as long as there were posters and flyers tacked all over with pictures on them, and firehouses opened to the street with little altars of the firefighters who had died, and firefighters' boots with dozens of roses in them. And, I can still get choked up thinking about what it was like to experience that. The loss of people and the interruption to business. Businesses closed because although there was aid for lost business, it wasn't indefinite, and it was bare bones aid, and people lost heart. Some people did well. I don't want to say that as an accusation. I think it's a testament to their strength that very quickly they could get their businesses going again and continue living under those circumstances and not let it bring them down. But not everyone could. And so what happened was, between the loss of residents and the loss of businesses, for quite a while, New York City felt a little bit like a ghost town. And the further downtown you got, the more ghost-like it was. And I do not use that word ghost-like, without deliberation. And I think that those changes created an opportunity for a big shift in New York City, from a city where residents jostled with tourists. There had always been a lot of tourists in New York, but the balance was skewed toward residents. Increasingly, when I would go back to do research for my book, the sidewalks were filled with tourists, were filled with newcomers who moved to New York, partly because rents were depressed, because landlords wanted to fill all these apartments that had been vacated. A lot of those newcomers thought they were doing a patriotic thing. I spoke to some of them. It was like, let's build the city. And some of them stayed and a lot of them left because they experienced the same after the fact difficulties that we did. You couldn't drive your car from where we lived for a long time. The roads were closed. You couldn't get a cab to bring you within a mile of where we lived. So if you wanted to do something uptown, for example, go to a show or meet someone for dinner, coming home, you had to walk the rest of the way at night. And, if the weather wasn't great, that was an additional factor. But so what New York feels to me, and of course the pandemic has in some ways recreated that same tipping point and shift. So it's become more expensive because people with money are investing. It's many, many neighborhood stores have closed and chains have come in to replace them. So it feels, the New York that I was still living in before 9/11 was a city with many vibrant ethnic pockets. Even in Manhattan, there are still vibrant ethnic pockets, but they are further from the center of the city because it's no longer possible to own a mom and pop operation. The rents are astronomical. So that's a fairly long-winded answer to how, in my experience, New York has changed. You could interview somebody else who would, not talk about that at all. But as someone who experienced the previous iteration and loved it, that felt like an additional layer of change and loss. Things are always changing, but the richness of that fabric was part of what made the hassle of living in New York worth it.
So why did you decide to write a book about your 9/11 experience?
The morning of 9/11, I experienced the immediate aftermath of the attacks from a different perspective from what was shown on television and what most people who fled north from the site observed. I was west of the towers. I did not want to flee north because it would have taken me very close to the towers where there were falling bodies and falling chunks of the building. And, not only was it terrible to see that, but I didn't want to survive and then get hit by that. So I fled south, and the only people fleeing south were people who lived on Staten Island who were heading to the Staten Island ferry, which I didn't know. I just said, I'm going the opposite direction. There's no way I'm going this way. So I went south and I followed the curve of the harbor and ended up on the Staten Island ferry with all Staten Island residents who were office workers on the last ferry to follow the regular schedule. It happened to be in its berth, waiting to leave at 10 o'clock, and we filled it up, and then the first tower came down while we were on the ferry, and that we thought we were all going to die. But eventually it pulled out. For the first half of its trip across the harbor, it was engulfed in that black smoke. You couldn't see a thing. And then around beyond the Statue of Liberty, we started emerging from it. When we got to Staten Island, as we were pulling in, the second tower fell and the cloud of smoke billowed out again. And I didn't know what, I got off the ferry. There were cops all over the place. Nobody knew what to do. I found my way to, there's a waterfront park adjacent to the ferry terminal. And I just sat down there. I didn't know anybody. I didn't know where to go. And some strangers took me to the local precinct where a cop in uniform was the first comfort that I personally experienced. I don't know his name, but I remember him vividly. And by then, other ferries were bringing survivors to Staten Island, people who fled south. And they started showing up at this precinct house. And a nearby cop opened her house to us. We had to walk a mile to get there. And there must have been, over the hours that I was there until I figured out where to go, there must have been 50 people who came, stayed a while. Most of them had a place to go. Clearly I couldn't go home. My husband coincidentally was at a meeting in Westchester. And so my goal was to get to Westchester. The question was how? And it was, on foot, by cab, by truck, by car service, over about 100-mile circle, because I had to go through Staten Island to New Jersey, through New Jersey to Rockland County, across the Tappan Zee Bridge, from which I could see the funnel of smoke rising from, I don't know how many miles away, at least 50 miles away. I was dropped in the dark at a closing gas station in Westchester and got in a stranger's car who took me to the house where my husband was. And that it was almost exactly 12 hours from the time I fled until I showed up at that house. And most of those memories are very vivid. I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to contribute to the historical record, a story which was different from how most people experienced the event. And then as time went by, I realized that as someone who lived nearby, my experience of the aftermath was also distinctive from most people's. And I felt that I had been lucky to be present at a world-changing event. And it was my job as a writer to bear witness to it. I believe the particularity of our stories is what brings us together. And I felt I had an obligation to this material. Of all the poets I know in New York City, and I live the closest to the towers, I was there that morning, and I thought that that was my story to tell.
So why did you, or how did you choose poetry as your form of expression for this particular story, or all the stories that you tell?
Well, I am a poet. I was a published poet. I already had published one collection before 9/11. That's the way I think. I like the compression of poetry. I like the power of it. Eventually, this book has a long section which is in prose, and it's called a prose poem. It's a kind of genre in which each small section follows some of what makes poetry poetry. Internal rhyme, a sense of rhythm to the line, without lines and without end rhyme. There can be a lot of internal rhyme. And eventually, and so the book is part that, part traditional poetry, part invented poetry. It seemed to me that no one form was adequate to express all the material.
What did you find most challenging about writing the book?
Not letting things I learned later creep into the contemporary accounts. And that was the first difficulty. But worse than that, or more difficult than that, was making myself write the most difficult moments. So there are 3 instances which I can think of right now, which had lodged in me in such a deep, difficult way. And I had told people about them. And then I went along and I wrote the book, and I was getting ready to publish it. I was doing my last revisions, and I showed it to my husband, and he said, "Do you realize that you forgot to write about X, Y, and Z?" And I had not even noticed that that was not in there. It was so present to me in my mind that I didn't need to have it on the page. So at that sort of late date, I had to write in the voice from the perspective of the me that had observed those things 18 years before. But I did it. And I feel like I honored those moments in the book. But the fact that I thought the book was finished and they weren't in there horrifies me. And horrifies is a judgmental term. I think it's understandable that I shied away from writing the most difficult moments. I'm grateful that it was called to my attention that I had not included them. So it took between staying true only to what I knew in the moment that I was writing about, and feeling like I had written as complete a portrait of my experience of that event and the aftermath as my skills made me capable of. I learned a lot as a writer during the process. It took me a long time, but by the time it was finished, I felt that I had done the book that I always wanted to write. And even though there's a lot of material on the cutting room floor, at one point the book was twice as long as it is, which is I imagined it as a theme collection of short stories only in verse. But poetry publishers do not want to, first of all, it's hard for people to pay attention to something. I had to break down the narrative into manageable chunks because even me, as the storyteller, would get exhausted and need a break. So anyway, the response has been pretty amazing. I think people's 9/11 stories got suppressed pretty quickly. We moved on. I don't need to tell you the litany of horrible things that have happened in this country and around the world since 9/11. Some of that was precipitated in different ways by 9/11. For example, the FEMA that went to New Orleans after the hurricane had been gutted because we went to war after 9/11, when I experienced what I call the good FEMA, with a lot of resources and a lot of talent. And so there have been, a world of stories. I don't want to only talk about this country because it's worldwide in scope. And I feel like we've been buffeted from disaster to catastrophe to tragedy in the last 20 years, and we're exhausted by it. Nonetheless, that buried material does not go away. And as I read about my experiences and talk about the book, the outpouring of other people's stories is humbling. Yesterday I did a Zoom reading, and today a person in the arts community in Los Angeles came to take my picture for a listserv that they have out here. I don't know her well. The next thing I know, she's telling me about her daughter who worked near the towers, who fled that morning north, the route that I told you that most people took, who saw people whose shoes had been lost, whose feet were cut with glass, who were nonetheless, because of adrenaline, you don't feel the pain, just heading north to get away. That's an extreme example. People who weren't born then, who start out thinking, well, why should I care about 9/11? On the other hand, their parents were affected by it. If you live in Southern California, chances are you know some soldier who went to the wars, who came back with whatever problems those soldiers came back with, if they were lucky to come back. And so you're the echoing tragedy of 9/11 is that, but people won't understand why. So I feel very humbled that my book has become an occasion for people to allow themselves to revisit this, to understand it in perspective, to connect with other people. And especially during the pandemic, when our connections have been so frayed, we're hungry for connection. And we're hungry, I don't want to sound like Pollyanna, I'm not, but we're hungry to believe that connection is possible. And it's difficult these days. For a long time for about 6 months after 9/11, even though I was a published poet and a part of my routine, and I was an editor of a poetry journal, words failed me. I did not write at all. And I felt guilty about that too, because if I can't write, if I can't express myself, what is my role? What is my purpose? And other people, friends of mine, who I thought sort of knew the whole deal. They had been along, side by my side through these years, either in person or long distance. Some of them, many of them, were very generous to me as I was writing the book. From them, I hear things like, I had no idea you went through that. Or, gee, your book makes me think of what I saw or what I experienced. And when I wasn't writing, part of what made me despair for a while was the loss of belief that language could bring us together. It's what separates humans from animals. And when language failed me, I really was afraid in a different way than just my own death, or I felt that if we as human beings can't share across our differences, what hope is there?
So what got you writing again?
I'm a writer, and when I don't write, I'm miserable. So I started with fragments. One of the poems in the book is composed entirely of little fragments I found on little scraps of paper that during the immediate those 6 months that we were displaced. There was a lot of paperwork and forms and medical stuff going on. And we just threw every piece of paper that came into our lives into bins. And, tax season came in April and we had to file tax returns. And as I was going through the paperwork, I would see these little scraps. And I put them all together and I did a sort of 52 card pickup. And I thought, well, this is a portrait of what my life was like, what was going on inside of me. And so I think there's a sort of fundamental human desire to make order out of chaos. And I started with words.
So tell me about the new project that you're working on.
The new project is an exploration of my father's experiences during World War II that he never spoke about. There's, two kinds of veterans. There's the garrulous kind and the silent kind, and my father was the silent kind. But growing up with him, I always sensed that his life after combat, even though he was in the medical corps, but he was in combat units, was nothing could compare with it. That was the sort of high point of his life. And I've come to believe that in some ways, 9/11 is the high point of my life. It's the fulcrum around which everything turns. And that gave me a sense of commonality with him. Plus, he died and I started going through his stuff, and he was like me with the scraps of paper. He was a keeper. But mostly I started this project thinking that, a complete break from 9/11. I am so ready to write about something else and turn my mind elsewhere. But of course, you are who you are. And my exploration, my father is irrevocably intertwined with mine as someone who survived 9/11, who demonstrated against Vietnam, who remembers Korea. I'm dating myself, but of course I got the white hair. I've earned it the hard way. But the more that I delved into World War II history, and he served in France and Germany, he was in the Battle of the Bulge, the more I began to think about the roots of intolerance that we are experiencing today as directly connected to World War II. They go way back. They go back as long as people have been people. And so I started thinking about that. And then that led me to a sense of connection with the continuation of terrorist attacks in Europe and the ongoing strife and violence in France between the enormous Muslim community there and the non-Muslim community. And, is a secular state possible? And I think all of this is at risk these days. So the next project is much more a sort of exploration of the issues that we live in today without an endpoint, but with, as a writer, it's fun to be thinking about the other languages than English. So that book is finished and it's under consideration at a publisher's right now. And I hope they'll take it. So it's called Dowry. So you can imagine the things that I do with that word. And after that, I think maybe I have 2 more books that I want to write. I'd like to have a break so I could get back to writing. Most poetry books have a pretty, they're a small pebble dropping into a big lake, and you accept that. This September 12th, because it touches on so many larger issues and happens to be poetry, has taken over my life since it was published in September. And I'm very pleased about that, but it's quite a learning curve and it's quite exhausting. So it's a part of the learning curve is learning how to deal with that. In this coming spring, this is assuming the latest COVID wave dies down enough. I have readings scheduled in the Midwest, and I have readings scheduled in New York, New Jersey, and the Northeast. And poets don't usually do reading tours. There isn't a big enough audience, but if there's interest in the book, I'm flattered, and I'm sort of rearranging my life in order to to make that possible anyway. So
yeah, it's for most writers, we like to be by ourselves and with our own thoughts, so that's why we become writers. So when you have to go and do that amount of publicity, it's kind of like the opposite of most of us, our strengths.
oh, and it's actually, in some ways, if I allow myself, it's my own worst nightmare. But in other ways, if you write, and it's true that coming out of that private place and being so in a public sphere is challenging. Partly, you don't have the private space anymore. So that thing that you draw on, that, where it's your comfort zone, you don't have that. But if you're a writer, you also, on some level, believe that writing is about communication. So the wider the sphere of communication that you can help or facilitate, the more complete the process is. Before I got published much, as I was writing, I always read to myself out loud. And only when I heard, because poetry is an oral tradition, only when I heard what I had written did I begin to feel it come alive. I mean, I like being creative on the page. I do a lot of fun things with the white space, but that isn't really enough for me. And I don't know if prose writers feel the same way, because the amount of time it takes. I mean, I have friends who only do audiobooks, and that's fine. But most people don't have the time to listen to audiobooks unless you have a nice long commute and can both listen to the book and pay attention to the traffic, which I have trouble doing. But excuse me. So, I don't know what your experience is as far as taking your writing out into the world. This podcast that you do is fascinating. And I looked at all the episodes and I listened to a few of them, and what interesting people. And, I heard several people that I think, well, I'm just going to sign up for their own things because I want to hear more of what they have to say, what they're interested in. One of my questions for you, I know you're not the subject of the podcast, but how do you find room for your own thoughts when you have such a full cabinet of curiosities, when you allow so many other people's thoughts and knowledge into your life?
That's an interesting...
You still read a lot?
That's an interesting question. I didn't even know when I started a podcast that I was going to have interviews.
Uh-huh.
I decided that I was going to do a podcast because I like the format of the podcast. I like it as a form of expression. I just put it out there that I was planning on doing a podcast, and people started coming to me to be interviewed. So that's how I started an interview show, and I fell in love with it. I didn't really realized I was going to be interviewing people, but as you said, there's so many fascinating people and stories, and I just felt like I was going to be a great conduit for telling other people or providing a platform for other people to tell their stories.
Well, you have, but it's probably changed your creative life because it's probably quite demanding.
It is
consuming.
Yes, it is demanding and consuming, and it has changed my creative life in that I'm much more interested in doing nonfiction now. Most of my creative endeavors in the past have been fiction, writing fiction. And now I've been delving more into the world of nonfiction and telling true stories.
Well, that's fascinating. It's not surprising, but it's interesting to hear. And one of the beauties of podcasts to me is that you get not only the material, but you get the material in the voice of the person whose material it is. And which was something in the past you had to go to readings. How many people went to readings? Not that many, very small. And a lot of people in the past, before I would say podcasts, their capacity to take in information only through their ears was limited. I know when I started going to poetry readings, I had to acquire skills to stay focused. It's like going to a musical, a classical music performance, and actually not only hearing the whole, but to hear the patterns and the themes and the repetitions. And that's just something you have to train yourself to do, that people have chosen to take the world in through hearing and sometimes seeing at the same time is, it's fantastic.
I agree.
And I mean, as a writer, I love doing research.
I do too.
I was one of the happier moments. I'll tell you two happy moments if you want. While I was doing research for September 12th, while I was in this woman's house on Staten Island, a beat reporter for the Staten Island newspaper called the Staten Island Advance came to the house to interview people who were there. And I remembered her vividly. And I wondered if I had talked to her. I didn't remember if I had talked to her. It wasn't one of the big moments of my day. So 6 years later, I went to the New York Public Library microfiche collection and I found her article. The Staten Island Advance had gone online entirely the next year, and I read about her and what she had written about that day. And here I was in this little dark cubicle in the basement of the 42nd Street Library and trying to get it into focus enough to read it. But there it was. And I learned it was her first day on the job. I read what I had said to her, which she had included in the article. And in fact, what I had said to her confirmed my memories of that day. So it was just a transcendent experience. The other thing that happened was the central section of the book is about the town where I grew up in New Jersey, called Glen Rock, New Jersey, which was a small commuter town, 7,000 residents.
And where was that?
In Bergen County, northwest of New Jersey, about 15 miles. And by the coincidence of the commuter train line that served that town and that area, the people who went to work in New York worked in Wall Street. And so the parents of my friends' fathers, my father was a teacher, so he wasn't one of those commuters, but all of my friends' parents commuted to New York City. And if 9/11 had happened when I lived there, some of them would not have come home. So I decided to write about this town. And I researched from contemporary sources, obituaries and newspaper articles and memorial sites, information about them. So I felt like I got to know these 11 people. And then I decided to go to the town and see where they had lived because that was available. Well, one of them lived across the house where my parents lived from the house when I was born. One of them lived next to my elementary school best friend. One of them lived down the street from my sister's best friend. One of them lived on the block where my beloved French teacher lived. One of them lived, I knew where all of them lived and I had connections to them. And so if I hadn't gone to the town, I still would have wanted to write about them and felt connected to them. But the connection deepened so much because of doing research. And needless to say, the research that I've been doing for the book about my father has been a joy. I get to read about all kinds of things. My father ended up at the American University in Biarritz at the end of the war, which was some actual university that they concocted overnight to keep soldiers in Europe rather than shipping them home in case they were needed in other areas of conflict, like the Far East. And it was cheaper to leave them in the military there and give them something to do than to bring them home and then ship them out again. And only after, I'm sad to say, Hiroshima did this idea get closed down. And even then it took 6 months for them to close it down. Anyway, I went to Biarritz on one of my research trips to France. And I saw where he lived. I saw where he studied. I talked with a man who curates the local Historical Society, who had been a child during World War II. And I saw the town was mistakenly bombed by us, by American pilots who missed the German fortifications and bombed the civilian population at a great loss of life. So there's a very ambivalent relationship there's a legacy of that mistake. And so the attitude toward the Americans were both, yes, you're resuscitating our economy but this is guilt money. So if I hadn't gone to Biarritz, I wouldn't have learned about that, because it's not, small details of history are very hard to sort of tease out of the wider matrix. And I suppose that's part of what motivated me to write the book about September 11th that I did, to put as many of those details out there so they wouldn't be completely lost. So I can only imagine, I think if I were coming of age now, instead of becoming a poet, I might have followed in your footsteps, because I can imagine how much fun it is.
Yeah, it's a tremendous amount of fun. Is there anything else you'd like to tell us about you or your work?
You can read more about this project and my other work on my website. I'm series editor of a poetry imprint at a press. Every year we put out a prize-winning book, and I get to work closely with the author, and that's basically fun. Oh, I have the usual checkered past of most writers. I've made a living many different ways. And I believe the arts make a difference.
And can you let listeners know what the URL is for your website?
Yes, it's www.andreacarterbrown.com. There's a page for September 12th there, which has a show and tell aspect with pictures of things I held on to, with little descriptions of what they are, and a abbreviated reading list of books that were sources to me. This book is infused with my love of New York City and my curiosity about it, which over the 14 years that I lived in this apartment on the cusp of Hudson River and downtown Manhattan, which is the oldest part of the city, every chance I could, I learned more about it. And I wanted to cram all of that into this book. And a certain amount of the stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor were those anecdotes. And so I thought, well, in lieu of that, if people are interested, I'll give a very selected bibliography of books that influenced me. But there's sample poems from all my books, and some outtake poems from this book, and a page about my editing, and there's, links to all the readings, online readings and podcasts that I've done, and people can reach me through that. And if people want to reach out to me with their stories, I'm grateful.
That's great. And that's at AndreaCarterBrown.com.
Yep.
It was great to have you on the show, Andrea. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
Thank you.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. On September 11, 2001, nearly 3,000 people were killed in the terrorist attacks on the USA. How many of those killed were firefighters and paramedics? 343 of those who died were firefighters and paramedics. We'll end the show with something punny. Did you hear about the vampire who turned into a poet? He went from bat to verse. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.